So on behalf of Feminist Dissent, I would like to welcome you all to the online public meeting on Roe v. Wade and reproductive justice in a global context. I'm Rashmi Varma, and I'm a member of the editorial collective of Feminist Dissent. Feminist Dissent is an online journal, blog site, and public project that focuses on the relationship between gender and religious fundamentalism and social and political authoritarianism. Our editorial collective consists of academics, activists, and writers. The journal platform is based at the University of Warwick in the UK, and we'd like to thank the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies and the Warwick Institute of Public Engagement for their support of our work. Please do look us up on our website, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and do send us submissions for our journal and blog. Before we go on to the actual program, I would like to express our deep sorrow at the recent passing away of Meredith Tax, our International Advisory Board member, exemplary writer, and feminist activist, beloved friend and comrade, and a relentless campaigner for women in Rojava. She will be missed, particularly today, as she was an important voice on the issue of abortion rights. Meredith Tax, may she rest in power. Today's meeting is a continuation of our work on fundamentalist politics in secular states, as we look at the overturning of Roe v. Wade and anti-abortion terrorism as a case in fundamentalist state and judicial capture. We ask what kinds of mobilizations are needed to oppose legislation to ban abortion, and whether there is a contemporary feminist movement which is willing to engage in grassroots activism to support women and girls to access abortion and to protect abortion providers under attack from right-wing terror in the US and elsewhere. We ask, will post-feminist, post-secular, or anti-secular politics of both left and right need to be challenged to build coalitions across difference to defeat the assault on both sexual and reproductive freedom? And what can we learn from the multi-directional struggles of the past to construct a feminist politics for the future? To address some of these issues and more, we have a stellar panel of speakers whom I will introduce only briefly, as each has an extensive resume that I cannot do justice to in the interest of time. We will begin with each of the four presenters speaking for no more than 10 minutes each. Since one of our speakers, Christina, has to leave soon after her presentation, we will have a brief Q&A after her talk. Otherwise, we will wait for all the speakers to finish and then open it up for discussion. At the end, each speaker will have 5 minutes to wrap up the discussion from their perspective and to point to future directions. So our speakers today are Gita Sahgal, who's a writer, filmmaker, and feminist and human rights advocate. She's the former head of the gender unit at Amnesty International and is an editorial collective member of Feminist Dissent. The next speaker is Cristina Gonzalez Velez, who is in the Faculty of Medicine at the Universidad de los Andes. She's the founder of the group for the Right to Decide, as well as a pioneer of Causa Justa movement in Colombia. After that is Rosalind Petchesky, who is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Hunter College, City University of New York. She's the founder of the International Reproductive Rights Research Action Group, among many other things. And last but not least, Katha Politt, who's a journalist, essayist, and critic, famous columnist for The Nation, and author of Pro: Reclaiming Abortion Rights, which was a New York Times notable book. So welcome to all the speakers, and thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to invite Gita to begin the proceedings. Sorry, to stop sharing, sorry. Gita, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
I had muted myself. I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now? I should be unmuted.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to have this meeting, and I hope it'll be one of many that Feminist Dissent holds, because we want to discuss these issues. It's not that we have all the answers. We need to look deeply at what's happening, because we live in dangerous times when populist movements and authoritarian governments combine in ever more deadly ways to sweep away nearly a century of rights gained by women's movements. The Christian right, in my view, has achieved a constitutional coup in the US, which was well signposted, even though the 6th January attack on Congress failed. But in many parts of Latin America, women have mounted a mass resistance, which I hope we'll be hearing something about today from the Colombian point of view. At stake in the battles around abortion are certainly ideas of women's autonomy and privacy, but also a much broader conception of rights relating to both reproduction and sexuality, which affect all areas of our lives. Social justice is incomplete without reproductive and sexual justice. At the heart of this struggle is the question of what society we want to live in. Women Against Fundamentalism and argued years ago, and Feminist Dissent does today, that fundamentalist movements are modern political movements which use a version of religion to impose their control on women's minds and bodies. Fundamentalist Christian organizations in both South and North America, from highly secretive societies like Opus Dei, which are Vatican connected, and a huge range of Christian evangelical groups, who decided quite correctly that Trump was their savior.
Please. Sorry, go ahead, Gita.
Seized political power and judicial power at the top and imposed their will on millions of people. The control of women is, of course, wider than fundamentalist movements and speaks to the heart of patriarchy itself. The fundamental question that the struggle for women's rights has asked is quite simple. Is a woman a person? Is she a full human being with a full range of capacity? Is she a person before the law? In most societies, the answer to all those questions is no. And it would be a mistake to assume that this is simply because some societies have not modernized enough. Technologies of control have been used in draconian ways to curtail women's emancipation. As numerous studies have shown, women have had methods of controlling their fertility, including performing abortions, for centuries. Today, as we remember Meredith Dax and other formidable feminists whom we've lost, I want to reflect on some of the gains of the past, where women attempted to talk across differences to construct analytical and campaigning frameworks which addressed all their needs. Meredith was a pioneer in reproductive rights when US feminists were fighting for abortion to be legalized. She was part of campaigns against forced sterilization. It would have been easy to argue that one was a problem of white women and the other of marginalized women of color. But her purpose was to get people to look at the deeper structures controlling women and to find common platforms to address apparently different questions so that women of different classes and backgrounds were joined in a common struggle. The term reproductive rights came out of these early campaigns. And this was right back in the 1970s before, and late 60s, I think, before Roe versus Wade was passed. By the 90s, during the brief peace dividend, when we thought the world might be a better place, briefly, thousands of women gathered at the NGO section of a major governmental conference on population and development in Cairo. Neera Yuval Davis and I were there working with women's networks, including challenging fundamentalism, advocating peace, and so on. But the organized presence of right-wing women was visible in such an international gathering for the first time. Iran's representatives were active, and they were in bed with the Vatican. But for all the dissension in both the NGO forum and the main government conference, Cairo produced an official program of action that was in effect a feminist critique of the gigantic population control agenda that had been harshly imposed on most of the developing world as essential to the promise of progress. There was some opposition to engaging at all. After all, the roots of family planning and early contraceptive campaigns lay in ugly eugenics theories, not entirely, but they were certainly present there. And forced sterilization was a tool used against minorities, typically indigenous women and Black women. One big exception was in India during a period of emergency rule, dictatorial rule, when men were sterilized, Muslim men were sterilized in large numbers. Meanwhile, Soviet and Eastern European women had access to abortion, but in harsh conditions, where they were provided with no preventive measures to protect against pregnancy, while China had imposed a one-child policy and forced abortion. So women didn't agree with what their problems were necessarily. Gayatri Spivak, a very prominent academic, argued that women in the global South did not need contraception because they had large families as a bulwark against poverty. And indeed, it would have been easy for feminist networks of the time, such as Dawn and IRAG, to denounce the population agenda and walk away, having canceled it in their minds. But instead, they set out with some success to change the language and therefore the very basis on which national governments and international organizations such as the World Bank and Population Council made their policies. The program of action of the ICPD, that's in Cairo, the International Conference on Population Development, was a consensus document negotiated between more than 180 states, which really put women's emancipation at the heart of any attempt to discuss development or population control. It stated women should be able to decide freely and responsibly the timing and spacing of their children. Abortion was highly contentious, but nevertheless, there was language that if it should be safe if legal. Gender equality, non-discrimination, and access to healthcare were to be fundamental to population programs. Women should have informed consent rather than be injected or sterilized without their knowledge. Did it immediately succeed? Of course not, but it became a basis for mobilization and concerted action. One of the roots of worldwide action had been the issue of public health and maternal mortality. Unlike the debate in the US, focusing on the constitutional protections of privacy and liberty, many governments hostile to abortion had to recognize or permit, even if they didn't really still allow abortion, as part of good practice, they had to permit the training of health professionals to conduct safe childbirth on the one hand, and good care and miscarriages. The right to abortion is not separate from, but rather embedded in holistic healthcare and pregnancy, hence the focus on reducing maternal mortality as part of UN development goals. But in defending these gains, international movements and organizations ignored emerging concerns. For years, Indian feminists have raised the issue of sex-selective abortions. They were not anti-abortion, indeed argued for wider, more comprehensive access, which only now, in a very recent judgment, the Supreme Court has partly dealt with, erasing the distinction between married and unmarried women. The sex ratio in India is abysmal, leading to the claim that there are millions of missing women. Not all of these are due to abortion, but to female infanticide and neglect of girls. Gori Chaudhary, another great feminist activist from India who died very recently, repeatedly raised this as an issue of human rights. Some legal theorists from India also argued it was a crime against humanity, as stated in a shadow CEDAW report. But in protecting abortion, there was a great failure to listen to Indian feminists. In meetings after Cairo, I saw their concerns being erased from the minutes of international discussions. Similarly, Amnesty International, of which I was the head of the gender unit, was very slow to adopt a position on abortion, and then did so without recognizing a broader frame of reproductive rights and justice. And they absolutely refused to listen to one of their bravest members of staff. Julia Tamayo, a Peruvian feminist, had become a refugee in Spain and worked with Amnesty Spain on women's rights. She was part of the Your Mouth is Fundamental Against Fundamentalism campaign, which linked fundamentalism to the neoliberal onslaught. Julia had investigated the forced sterilizations of indigenous women and linked them to state counter-terror policies. But when, as head of the gender unit, I tried to include this view in our campaigning, it was rejected. And I'm happy to note that Julia's work on Peruvian feminist campaigning has been vindicated. And I hope we'll discuss that more in another meeting. Today, we need to understand how women and social justice movements can mobilize to defeat the criminalization of abortion, as well as so many other areas of life, censorship in education, attacks on healthcare provision, and so on. Are there legal avenues? Are women organizing to support each other? And how have women across the world dealt with providing contraception and abortion care across the world, sometimes without the support of the medical profession? Tonight, we start a discussion on these issues, and I look forward to hearing our speakers, Anna, Ros, and Katha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gita, for that wonderful start to our discussions. And I'd like to now invite Anna Cristina to make her presentation. Anna.
Thank you very much, Rashmi. I would like, first of all, to thank for the invitation and for having me here and for your consideration with my time limitations. But I will stay like 40 minutes from now. So I think I will be able to hear some other friends. And I'm so happy also to see faces that I admire so much, as March, for example, that is in there. So I will try to speak about three things, and I will link these questions. The first thing I want to talk about is about the ways in which Latin American feminists have succeeded in defeating the most restrictive abortion legislations in the world with different strategies. So in the last 15 years, several Latin American countries have witnessed an increase in social mobilization in the struggle to liberalize abortion laws. In the context of such process, feminist reformist demands have become increasingly legalized. The legalization of pro-liberalization claims can be observed at least in two dimensions. The first one is the diversification of legal reform goals and the fora in which such goals are being pursued. And second, the expanded repertoire of legalized strategies and tactics deployed by the liberalizing camp. We have seen transformation from social to legal mobilization that entails a redefinition of the relationship between Latin American feminists with the law and legal institutions, including practices of cooperation and information sharing that partially account for the redefined relationship between feminists and the law. To show that success, I will focus in Colombia, where Causa Justa movement filed a claim that ended in a decision issued by the Constitutional Court in February this year, stating that abortion won't be a crime when performed before 24 weeks of pregnancy, and in all cases, this time limit will not apply to the three exceptions to the crime of abortion as stipulated in ruling 355 of 2006 to save women's life or protect their health in cases of fetal malformation and rape. Additionally, the court urged the Congress and the national government to, without prejudice, to formulate and implement a comprehensive public policy to prevent the wide gaps in the protection of dignity and the rights of pregnant women as described in this ruling. But how did this happen? Causa Justa was born as an initiative of La Mesa, a feminist organization from Colombia that became a movement as a result of the strategy we designed in two phases. The first one was kind of internal work And during that phase, we developed 90 arguments. We called for a collective effort. We convened all the organizations working in human rights, abortion, feminism, and we designed a strategy with areas for strategic work. I will highlight here 5 of those areas. The first one was the pedagogical work with different audiences. Second, we did political communications based on 3 pillars, with news and presence in traditional media, including virtual media, with social networks for causa justa and mobilization in the streets. We also produce research and new research during the process and work at the regional level. And of course, we built a mechanism to work together. We are now more than 114 organizations and networks organically part of Causa Justa in about 20 cities in the country. And the second phase was the public conversation. So Causa Justa was born to promote a national and public conversation aimed to explain to different sectors and actors and through different tools and strategies and arguments, as I already mentioned, why the crime of abortion was unfair, counterproductive, inefficient, and discriminatory, and why we had decided to make efforts to repeal abortion crime from the penal code. During the public conversation, we started in February 2020, and during the 523 days the court took to study our claim, right-wingers participate very little in the debates, and the media left behind the idea of creating debates with one in favor and one against. People really wanted to learn about our arguments according to statistics, because we measure the digital conversation around abortion during all those days. And we know that we dominated the conversation on abortion in the country. The arguments from the right-winger, from the anti-rights movements were basically 3: that abortion is a murder of an innocent person. Second, that there is a person since conception, and that abortion affects women's mental health. But against those 3 arguments, we managed to discuss and debate around 90 arguments, as I already mentioned. And second, during the process of the legal claim, the focus of their actions was to use the procedural legal tools in an abusive way. They presented more than 15 requests to void, and they used the recusal of judges. And after the decision, they are still or again focused in procedural actions like requests of nullity of the decision and a referendum proposal they are working in. So I think the role of the law in these struggles is a bit obvious, but on the legal strategy we designed it, we included different things. For example, discussions of critical issues like res judicata, conversations with the Criminal Law Commission, a law project proposal, and even the idea of file the claim. We work on all these options, and according to the opportunities, we decided where to go. And we identified the opportunity to move forward with the legal strategy. That happened in September 2020. And remember that we launched the movement in February. So we had all those months of public conversation explaining why we should repeal abortion crime. We filed a claim at the court, and then we deployed the strategy I described above with different strategic areas of work, and we work to get 114 amicus curiae at court. So our goal was to transform the paradigm to regulate abortion, abandoning the use of criminal law. And for that, we requested the court to repeal abortion crime. As the decision said clearly, it falls to the court to determine if the article that defines the crime in our penal code is contrary, as they recognize, to the obligation to respect the right to health and the reproductive rights of women, girls, and pregnant individuals due to the barriers we had identified along 15 years of having been contributing to the implementation of the indications that existed since 2006. If the crime of abortion violates an individual's freedom of conscience, particularly regarding the ability to act according to one's convictions on reproductive autonomy. And third, if if that crime is incompatible with the preventive purpose of the punishment and doesn't meet constitutional requirements assigned to the ultima ratio character of criminal law. And finally, if the crime fails to recognize the right of equality for women in vulnerable situations and women with an irregular migrant status. And all those rights were recognizing the decision as rights that have been violated due to the existence of a crime of abortion. Of course, we still face many challenges, at least in 3 fronts. The first one is the implementation of the decision, including the formulation of a public policy and the elimination of barriers. The second is what we call the protection of the judicial decision. We know that we need to protect the decision politically, legally, from nullities and referendums, and culturally, including the protection of women's rights defenders. And finally, we face challenges around social decriminalization. We need to build environments of legitimacy for women's decisions, and this includes to strengthen the Causa Justa movement that became a referent in the country for authorities, politicians, the media, and the youth. And finally, I want to refer to something very, very important for you all, and is the reiterative question these days regarding the repeal of Roe versus Wade decision in the United States, and about what will happen in Latin America and the world. And I believe that this decision will undoubtedly be used politically by those who have always strongly opposed the agenda of sexual and reproductive rights, especially about abortion, without caring about women's life, dignity, or freedom. Undoubtedly, it is a wrong, anachronistic decision that will cause enormous damage to women in the United States, particularly the most vulnerable. But apart from that, I would like to seriously state that the only side of the decision of the Supreme Court is not its disastrous effects on the region. I believe with modesty that this could be a time to look to the South, from where we have contributed substantially to guaranteeing the right to abortion. The advances we have seen in the last decades in Uruguay, Mexico, Argentina, and more recently in Colombia confirm that the US can learn a lot from the South, specifically around 3 things. The arguments. Today we have a jurisprudence rooted in fundamental rights beyond the right to privacy, because we have recognized that the criminalization of abortion violates the right to health, equality, and freedom. And we have challenged the use of criminal law to regulate a health service such as abortion. Second, around strategies. Today we can show legal, constitutional, and health advances. We have incorporated abortion services into our health systems, expanded access to abortion with the use of medicines, and now we have a contingent of women supporting other women to abort safely at home. And finally, around our movement. In Latin America, we have a robust and organized movement, assuming the cultural battle of this century, women's reproductive freedom, and the battle includes the fight for the elimination of the crime of abortion globally. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ana Cristina. I think you're absolutely right. There's so much to learn from your experiences and your struggles, but also your victories, which must be acknowledged. And so I think because you have to leave in a little bit of time, perhaps we could invite questions or comments based on your presentation, either from the other panelists or from anyone in the audience. You could type in your questions in the chat, or I think I should be able to recognize you. If you raise your hands, it'll show up. So maybe about 5 to 8 minutes of discussion with Ana Cristina, and then we will go back to the panel. Okay. Anyone? Is there a raised hand? Can I see? I have questions for her, but I don't want to monopolize or to go first. So if anyone else wants to. Okay, I guess while people are formulating their questions, given the work that we focus on in feminist dissent, and Christina, my question was about the role of religious fundamentalism or the religious right and you know, those sort of social and political forces that you are dealing with, and how are they part of your strategy in terms of securing reproductive rights for women?
Thank you, Rashmi. And I saw a couple of questions also in the chat about ideas on how to protect progressive judicial decisions, and also recommendations on readings. We have a couple of publications in English, including a chapter in a book. So then I can share with you. And I have to say that one of the first publications we made around this idea of repealing abortion crime was edited by March. So we also have some papers that I can share later with you all. If you agree, I can send it by email, and then you can share with the entire group. I think the question about the protection of the decision is very important for us, because once we got the decision from the court in February, one of the first things that we identified, and what happened in the US hadn't happened yet, was that we needed to protect the decision. And that protection needs to happen at 3 different levels from our perspective. One is a legal protection. So now we are seeing threats against the decision. There are groups of people looking for signatures because they want to call to a referendum. And I think this is a very important conversation, because you cannot, call for a referendum for decide if a person has a right, if women have rights. So how can you call a referendum for that? But you cannot say that referendum is an anti-democratic mechanism, because it is, in fact, a democratic mechanism. So it's becoming very sophisticated and difficult. And in fact, we have like a kind of campaign in order to organize in a silent way on how are we going to manage this referendum thing that haven't happened, but they are working for that. So we need to protect legally. And it also means that every time that any lawyer, like a very famous Colombian lawyer, anti-rights lawyer called Natalia, is presenting suits all the time in the court, filing claims all the time in the court, we need to be answering to their demand, to their claims, and participating actively in the court. So that's one level. But the other level is political. We've seen that in every campaign or around any political thing in our country, people try to use the contents of the decision to get more votes, as they believe they can get votes if they pronounce something against the decision. But these are like pigs in the public conversation. It's something that they use just to do politics. And the other level is cultural, because at the end of the day, we have decided that we are not going to be silent anymore around these issues. So we are doing all the time public actions. We are recalling that we have now this decision and that we have to implement it. And we have a strategy that I don't have to share with you here, but we are like focused on that protection of the decision. And finally, I think that religious fundamentalists in Colombia, as I already explained, it's curious because they didn't took part in the public conversation. they really didn't participate in a strong way. And it was because while we had 90 arguments, and that's a lot because we had arguments for everyone, for all the publics, they just had 3 arguments that nobody wants to hear that much. So they decided to go through the procedural tools that we have in our law and use those procedural tools in order to try to get some backlash. So we need to give them some conquer, and their goal is to I forgot the name in English, to withdraw. I forgot the word, but they just want to fight against every victory we get. So that's more or less how they are doing these days in Colombia. But we know that fundamentalists are multiple and they are interlinked. So we know they are now working with some specific political parties and with some specific media, mass media companies in our country. So now we know how they are articulated through different powers. And I think that that's also important.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Maybe you could take one or more. There's one question about misogyny in the US judicial system. I don't know whether you want to take it or if there are other questions. There's one from Vanita Mukherjee. Do fundamentalists in Colombia hold any political position or part of a political party fighting elections?
Oh yeah, we have a couple of evangelics, and we've seen also a growing participation from, especially those coming from evangelics, and they are articulated around parties. And in fact, one of the referendums they are trying to move has been proposed by evangelics, mainly, that they have a party and they have been participating in Congress, and they don't have right now any critical position, but we have one judge in the Constitutional Court that is totally an anti-right lawyer, judge, and he's been trying to do, for example, he admitted recently a new claim from this lawyer that I mentioned is an anti-right lawyer, that it's being like filing claims, I don't know, every week at court. And he finally admitted one of her claims, and we are expecting to see what is he planning to do. But this is a constant and endless battle in court, in society, in the Congress, with sanitary authorities. And what we know and we have learned is that, as I already said, we need to continue speaking loud and denouncing and strengthening our movement, because at the end of the day is our best asset.
Thank you, Anna Cristina. I see Gita's hand is up. Gita, do you want to ask your question? And maybe that can be the last one. And then if we have more questions later, Anna Cristina, and if you've left, we will share them with you, and hopefully you can, respond to people. So Gita.
Well, Vanita's question was on fundamentalists. Do they hold any political position, which I think Anna's partly answered. But I thought was interesting because I made a distinction between the Vatican in the South and Evangelicals in the North, but of course they're both present in both places. I was rather schematic. And I wanted to ask Anna whether for Colombian women, the women's movement, and Latin American women generally, there is the separation of church and state is an important issue, because I certainly remember that it used to be and was raised like at World Social Forums and so on. But I'm just wondering whether that's still the case.
The separation of what? Can you repeat, please?
Church and state, the secularizing the state.
Well, that's one of the things that we've been arguing in public discussions, and we also included an argument on that in our claim to the court, because we, in theory, we live in a secular state, and I think that we have managed to maintain Catholic Church and evangelics out of public decisions, especially when it is about sanitary decisions. But it's much more difficult at Congress, because now we have people that is openly fighting for an agenda from a religious perspective. So I think this is one of the most difficult things we are facing in our region, because we have seen a growing participation of these parties in the Congress. And we also, of course, have some work that we have done mainly as an Articulación Feminista Mercosur, trying to denounce the taxes exemptions that we know we have in our countries for different churches, and that's something that we've been exploring in terms of how to argue and to continue fighting to keep this separation between the state and the church.
Okay, I see one more hand up, Afra. Maybe this can be the very last question, if you can keep it brief. Afra. I don't see Afra's hand up anymore. Okay, here's the written question. To what extent do you believe the system in the US protects women? Maybe that's a question more for Ros and Katha, who are to come. So we will hold off for now on that. But thank you once again, Anna Cristina, for your wonderful contribution. And I'm sure people will have lots of questions and thoughts based on what you've said. And if they are in the chat, we will send them over to you. But I hope you can stay for as long as you can manage. Okay, so
thank you for your time. I will stay a couple of minutes. I'll try to hear a bit to Rosalind, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd now like to invite Rosalind Petchesky, who I see did join us. I've already introduced you, Rosalind, so we'd like to invite you to talk.
Well, thank you very much. First, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, good. Sometimes we have trouble with these systems.
Yes.
So I've been thinking a lot about what's new and what's old. You referred to the decision that overturned Roe versus Wade in the United States. And I'm sure everybody knows about that and has read about that. If you want me to detail the decision's findings, so-called, it's repercussions, which have been horrible, the tendency toward criminalization of abortion, new things that really dug out of the past, the fugitive slave laws to track women down, bounty hunters. These people actually amaze me because they have so little imagination. They come up with nothing new. The only new thing I've found is some of their language about the fetus. They now call the fetus the preborn, and they have stolen the Black Lives Matter. They're so desperate for communication vehicles that will be effective that they stole the Black Lives Matter logo, and they say, with the same colors, the same logo, Black preborn lives matter. So the fetus is now called the preborn. But that's all beside the point of what I want to say. What's really, really old in the United States is a political and cultural and legal and religious climate of white Christian nationalism. racism, xenophobia, hysteria about immigrants, especially those who are Black and brown, and this white Christian nationalism that is endemic to the society. What's new is a political context in which that white Christian nationalism is now laid bare. It's exposed for all to see, and that's because it has captured not only, the Republican Party, the federal courts, United States Supreme Court, many state and local politicians. And what happened with the Dobbs decision that repealed Roe was very strange, because many feminists, liberal and liberal jurists said, what? How could this happen? Where did this come from? As if it came out of nowhere. Well, I want to quote the marvelous feminist giant, the Egyptian-American Mona El-Tahawi, who recently wrote, and really incredible, everybody should get her newsletter, Mona El-Tahawi, E-L-T-A-H-A-W-Y. She wrote, one of her recent pieces is called Dear White Women Cheering Iranian Women. And in that, she says something that we all, certainly in the US, have to listen to. Fascism doesn't happen overnight. Theocracy is not built in a day, and fascist theocrats are obsessed with what's on our heads and what's in between our legs. Thank you, Mona. I also want to cite a guy who's a far right-wing Christian nationalist candidate for governor in the state of Pennsylvania right now. His name is Doug Mastriani. He happens to have publicly urged that women who get abortion should be convicted of murder. He also said, America is a Christian nation and the separation of church and state in the US is a myth. Well, apparently 61% of Republicans polled recently agree with him. And guess what? I do too. I agree with him about that. I agree with him as a Jewish girl a Jewish woman who grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1950s. That experience, and I'm going to focus a lot. This will sound very peculiar to some of you. Maybe you never even heard of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm going to argue it was the epicenter of the rise of the white Christian right. I knew in my gut as a very young girl that white Christian nationalism was the prevailing political culture in our part of the country anyway, even if I didn't have the words to describe it. It was the air we breathed, and more than overt anti-Semitism, the invisible wall that kept most Jews, like my family, marginalized and alienated. Engraved in my memory is when the Christian Crusade and Athletes for Christ would visit our supposedly public schools every year, and we were supposed to go to their assembly. Well, my parents would have to write a note for me to excuse me from this assembly, and I would be unceremoniously escorted out into the hall where I would stand by myself until the event was over. Of course, this isn't equivalent to the deep white racism going back to the 1921 Greenwood Massacre in Tulsa, very famous. And I don't claim it is, but it was painful. Tulsa, Oklahoma was famously the oil capital of the world, and was also, according to its most effective evangelical preacher, the Christian fundamentalist capital of the world. Of course, these two things are connected. The billionaire oil barons in Texas and Oklahoma who controlled the Republican Party there needed the evangelical churches to establish a popular base. It was a marriage of convenience that would deepen over the next 3 decades and gradually become national and to some extent international. And I may talk about that later if there's time, with Trump and his globe-trotting fascist brain, Steve Bannon. This white Christian nationalism would inform the Supreme Court and its decision in Dobbs, would entice political leaders in Hungary, Poland, Brazil, Spain, Israel, Netanyahu's flirtation and love of the evangelicals, Italy, so many right-wing parties and forces for whom abortion and reproductive justice represent the antithesis of their vision of authoritarian Christian theocracy. Well, I want to focus on one guy. His name is Billy James Hargis. It doesn't matter if you remember him, but he was the most important and influential evangelical fundamentalist in Oklahoma and the region, the whole southwestern region of the United States when I was growing up, along with a guy named Oral Roberts, whose headquarters was 2 blocks from our house, and I had to pass it every day walking home from school. But anyway, in a recent article in The Nation writer Sarah Posner talks about how a guy named, you don't need to remember these names, but a guy from Texas, Paul Pressler, engineered the takeover of the entire Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptists are the biggest Protestant denomination in the United States. And this was in the 1970s and 80s. Well, I think she mistakes this origin period. She ignores the previous 2 decades. And that was the time when Billy James Hargis founded the Christian Crusade in 1950. My brother Nathan and I went to a Christian Crusade rally at a downtown movie theater in Tulsa in 1960. And it was very interesting. I mean, we were sort of spies. We saw ourselves as spies. And the whole slogan of that rally was impeach Earl Warren. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at that time. It was the court that ruled in Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate the public schools. And Warren was considered the arch enemy of the evangelicals. They were also highly and virulently anti-communist. In that rally, Billy James Hargis said, everyone in the audience who's a communist, he thought he was being cute. Everyone in the audience who's a communist, stand up. Well, my brother stood up and I said, Nathan, sit down, we might get killed. The Christian Crusade inherited from the Ku Klux Klan a tradition of what we today call intersectionality, transforming it into religious dogma. In other words, turning it on its head. Anti-communism, very vicious white racism, patriarchal family values, misogyny, homophobia, xenophobia, the whole nasty stew of hatreds was their politics. Billy James Hargis saw the world as a struggle between good and evil, Christ and Satan. All I want to do is preach Jesus and save America, he said. Well, he wanted to save America not only from Satan worship, but from sex education and the denial of prayer in the schools. The right wing at that time, when I was growing up, they were really focused on sex education in the schools. In other words, sexuality and gender were deep in their sights. And this denial of prayer in the schools, was part of what I experienced when I was sent out into the hall. They also were strong champions of racial segregation. Hargis called segregation one of God's natural laws. He hated Martin Luther King, the NAACP, and increasingly targeted drugs, sexual revolution, homosexuals, rising feminism. So what you'll understand quickly when you look at the history and the coincidence of dates is that the early rise of the US-based white Christian nationalist movement coincides with the beginnings of second wave feminism, the rise of a radical youth culture and the LGBTQ movement in the 1960s and early 70s, and of course the Black civil rights movement. In other words, its genealogy is completely reactionary. And that's something of what Christina was talking about in Colombia as well, this reactionary tendency. And also in a religious context, they were reacting to a new, more inclusive social justice preaching of the gospel by Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders. And also they hated the popularity of liberation theology in Latin America. They were very aware of it. So we were engaged in a cultural war. It continues to this day. I wanted to talk about somebody named Anita Bryant, She's a very interesting character in this story. And she's also from Tulsa. She was from my rival high school in my city. She was about 2 years ahead of me. She became Miss Oklahoma in 1958. And then she became this ardent fundamentalist Christian leader of the anti-gay movement. And she moved to Florida, to Miami-Dade County in Florida. And what was interesting about her is that at a certain point, these Christian theologians, the male Christian theologians, dumped her when I guess they decided they didn't have any use for her anymore. And she came out and flipped on them. And I just think this is fascinating. This is from my book on abortion, published 100 years ago, at least. Finding herself divorced, jobless, and denounced by the male-dominated church that has made millions of dollars off her name, by 1981, Bryant claimed to better understand the gays and feminists' anger and frustration. She saw a male chauvinist attitude in the kind of sermon she always heard growing up in the Bible Belt. Wife, submit to your husband even if he's wrong. And she thinks her church has not addressed itself to women's problems. She wrote, or she said in an interview, fundamentalists have their head in the sands. The church is sick right now, and I have to say, I'm even part of that sickness. I often have had to stay in pastors' homes and their wives talk to me. Some pastors are so hard-nosed about submission and insensitive to their wives' needs that they don't recognize the frustration, even hatred, within their own households. Well, what Anita was probably onto, like the later Anita Hill, was that these guys were notoriously and ubiquitously sex predators. All of them were charged with sexual abuse of both male and female, victims. And that's a whole story in itself. Well, these early white nationalists were wrong in one respect. They were too sectarian. And so by the 1980s and what we've called the new right, something changed, and it was extremely important. And that was a rapprochement between the Protestant evangelicals and the Catholics. They came together around a very similar politics. Their documents of their alliance, they commonly, and this was the same time that the Vatican was moving in a very evangelical direction, very right-wing, and very anti-feminist. So this, it's not an accident. They shared a political ideology of white Christian supremacy, patriarchy, and traditional family and sexual norms under the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. The Bible is always literally true. Patriarchy, etc., and rugged heteromasculinity. The anti-abortion movement after Roe versus Wade became its political battering ram, the political battering ram of this movement. Catholic bishops and churches in the US played a leading role. But their real long-term goals were domination over local school boards, the Republican Party, electoral politics, and the heretofore liberal US Supreme Court.
Ross, could you wrap up?
Oh, sure. I'm
yeah.
sorry.
No.
Okay. What I'll leave, what they got out of this alliance was a political base. They got organizational levers and voting blocks. And this all developed through these decades to the point where here we are, Christian nationalist fundamentalists. And here is Mona El-Tahawi. I'll have to come back to what do we do, I'm afraid. But I want to quote her from that letter to white women cheering Iranian women. She says, Roe versus Wade was overturned this summer by the Supreme Court of the United States, a court stacked with Christian zealots. It was overturned because very ordinary Christian zealots who voted for fellow very ordinary white Christian zealots who installed other Christian zealots on courts, including the highest court in the land. And this, she said, was the biggest victory of a white Christian theocratic revolution. Her message to US feminists Where the fuck is your feminist revolution against your theocrats? Why can't you get in the streets and burn shit down? And I agree with her entirely. And in the discussion, would be happy to come back to questions of how we get there. What do we do? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roz. That was brilliant, the way you connected all the dots and sketched the genealogy of, our current conjuncture where we are at the moment. And absolutely, we will be doing a round of summation in terms of what next and what we can do. So we look forward to your to hearing more from you then. But over to Katha Politt now for her presentation. We can't hear you, Katha.
I'm here now.
Okay. Yes.
I unmuted myself. Thank you so much for having me here. It's so interesting to listen to the other speakers and feel some kind of energy and solidarity instead of, depression and despair. I want to say, Roz was so interesting about the fundamentalist roots of all this reaction going on. But I want to say two things about that. And one is, it's the very strange nature of the United States political system has a lot to do with this. Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. In any other country in the world that had elections, she would have been president and things would have been very different. Those reactionaries would not have been on the Supreme Court or staffing lower courts. It would have been a great moment of forward movement for women, I believe. I mean, even if she's not your favorite person, there were some issues she was very, very good on. Instead, we got a person who combined complete amorality with a charismatic personality that I don't understand it. I do not understand how people admire him and want to be like him and think he's really great, but an enormous number of people feel that way. They would not have felt that way about, and they didn't about, Mitt Romney or other anti-choice Republicans. It was specifically Donald Trump's insane appeal to a very large number of people, but not enough to get him elected. But once he was elected, that didn't matter. That all went away and he got to do whatever he could get away with, which was a lot. And now he and his followers control the Republican Party. And all the people we used to think of as Republicans who were, sort of businessy people that, were kind of rational. They were just wrong about a lot of things and in with the ruling class. That's all gone. Those people like what's her name? Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney couldn't even get
I think Katha is frozen there. Yeah. Let's. Hopefully she can hear this see this message. Let's give it a minute. Mm. She- what should we do? I think, Stephen, you have Katha's email. If someone can email her to leave and then rejoin. And meanwhile, perhaps we can go to questions and discussions based on what Gita and Ros have talked about, but also, yeah, have the two of you and others start a conversation while we wait for Katha to come back. Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Gita, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm, of course, was fascinated by Ros's discussion, and I need to chase up all those names because we do actually need to know these names of all these people who've constructed, elements of the Christian right. I'd say one thing from what I dimly remember, having looked at the origins of the term Christian fundamentalism, that was actually used by some oil billionaires. I think that marriage was not only a marriage of convenience. I think it was a marriage of ideology. And of course, it was used in the oil world in the East as well. I mean, it was used in the Arab world to shore up fundamentalist dictators. They were part of the project of imperialism. They were part of the project of destroying secular nationalist movements and radical movements, communist movements, and so on. So I think there's always been a link between oil and fundamentalism, both in the US and with the Saudis and the Emirates and all kinds of other people. Is Katha back with us?
I'm not sure. No.
So
No.
then I'll just say one more thing, and maybe other people have questions. I think the links between white supremacy and this kind of Christian right are absolutely compelling. And in my work on Hindutva, I've talked about the links between Stephen Bannon, and the Hindutva right, and his embrace of certain aspects of that, and the Hindutva's embrace of him, conversely. But I do wonder whether it's only white. I mean, I think one of the issues that we're facing, and one of the things that we really have to struggle with, is the strength of these fundamentalist movements within very marginalized communities and within communities of color. So Hispanic movements, conservative Black churches in the US, and we see that repeated in the way in which Hindutva, which is started as an upper caste, at least middle class movement, has spread to many other constituencies who in fact carry out a lot of the violence for them. So, I'm wondering about Clarence Thomas, for instance, on the Supreme Court, and many other prominent Black commentators who've joined that movement, as well as Hispanic evangelicals.
Yes, Ros, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I couldn't agree more with Gita. Gita, thank you very much. Certainly, on two counts. It was not merely a marriage of convenience. A lot of these oil barons ideologically were very affiliated, and how spiritual that was, I do not know. But ideological, political, absolutely. And I also appreciate your link to the Saudis, and we'll look forward to looking at your book. The other thing that you were talking about, the penetration, sorry, using the word advisedly, the penetration of communities of color and, powerful people like Clarence Thomas. I mean, Clarence Thomas is now guiding the US Supreme Court. And he is the most racist person and the most unfriendly, to the civil rights movement, even though it helped him get where he is. So absolutely, these are ideologies. They're not identities in people's DNA. So I also just wanted to mention that I didn't even say the name Donald Trump. You notice that? I didn't say it because part of my point was to emphasize that Trump and Trumpism are the kind of emanation of a long history. And, these right-wing groups, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Vigilantes, they've been around forever. But what Trump did through some of what Katha was talking about, his charisma, his TV personality, and the moment, he legitimated them. He liberated them. And now they're everywhere. They're running for office. So it is a different moment rooted in the same. And I don't think it's useful to put too much emphasis on Trump as if he gets all the credit. It's not accurate, I think.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And also what I guess is shared in this global moment are these charismatic right-wing leaders in so many different, parts of the world in this sort of current moment is also something to think about. But I think Katha is back, and hopefully we can maintain a good connection this time. Katha, are you here? I just saw her coming.
She's here. She's muted.
Oh, okay. Katha, you're muted. Let me see if I can unmute her.
Audio. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
Welcome back.
I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. I just lost the internet, and then eventually it came back. Everything seemed to be okay, but I guess it wasn't. Anyway, where was I? I guess the point I was trying to make is that the fact that so many of our institutions and whole political party are now controlled by bigots, and in some cases crazy people who believe in, that Democrats are lizard people, are pedophiles who drink children's blood and all like that. This is in some ways an artifact of our system. It does not represent how most people think and feel. Most Americans favor abortion rights. They may not favor later abortion rights, but they favor them certainly in the first trimester. And they certainly don't believe that 10-year-olds should have to have babies when they're raped by their mother's boyfriend. But those people have the upper hand now. Those reactionary, often Christian evangelicals, but not entirely them. They have the upper hand now. And I think, Ross is certainly right that it's all the product of this confluence, this long-term confluence of racism, of machismo, of fanatical anti-communism, and this strain of real paranoia that runs through American history. So that's what we have to work with, unfortunately. We're stuck with that. But, looking at it from another perspective, America which did elect Joe Biden, I have to say, we get some credit for that. We elected Joe Biden, and who is, after a slow start, I think pretty good. He's doing what he can. But we're also sort of part of this worldwide increase in reactionary politics, in anti-feminism, in turn back, in pro-religious stuff, not just Christianity. Look at India, Hindu, and the Muslim world is not so great. So all over the world, something is happening. And I think it's too simple in a way to attribute it to the machinations of billionaires, for example, which is something we get a lot of in the United States. It's, I think, the very deep discomfort with modernity. And, some people really don't like it. They feel very left behind. They feel very alienated from their society. Economic stagnation is, always promotes reaction. People are afraid of losing what they have, etc. So anyway, so here we are, and women are the victims of this, but also sometimes the perpetrators of this. I just, I don't know how closely people here follow American politics, but what's going on, it cannot be overemphasized, is truly awful. Right now, there's most abortion has been banned in at least 14 out of the 50 states, with more to come. I mean, they're just sort of gearing up. And so you see things like women who are in very serious physical danger with their pregnancies, who are being denied abortions, even though these, the exception might say, except when the woman's life is at risk. Well, sometimes when her life is at risk, she still can't get an abortion. Horrible, horrible things are going on. And along with a lot of weirdness. For example, one of the more recent things that happened is that Arizona had passed a 15-week ban on abortion, which some people think, oh, well, okay, that's a good compromise. Let's just, up to 15 weeks, just like in many countries in Europe, and then afterwards, if you need it for a serious health reason. And Arizona duly passed, and the very conservative Republican governor signed into law such a ban. But the ban was overturned made irrelevant in light of a judicial decision that no, what really has to happen in Arizona is that we resuscitate the original ban against all abortion that was put on hold, but never, undone by Roe v. Wade. So that law now comes back into force. Well, that law is from 1864. Arizona was not even a state in 1864. And that law was then ratified in 1901. And Arizona still wasn't a state. So, I mean, how far back do we go, So here we have women, today's living women are ruled by a law that is 170 years old. Even though no one, that law could not get passed today, probably in Arizona. So things like that are happening all over, just the wildest every day in the news. In fact, Jessica Valenti, who is a very prominent and wonderful feminist, has started a daily email called Abortion Every Day. All abortion comment every day. And she just makes a record of all these terrible things are happening. And if you read it before you've had your coffee, you just really never want to get out of bed. Let me just take a look at these notes. Oh, okay. So now an interesting thing about the whole abortion thing is the way it's connected to so many other things. For example, freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is a value that at least Americans pay a great deal of lip service to. There is that big libertarian streak in Americans of all political stripes. So the latest thing there is that the University of Idaho bans the college healthcare center from providing students with birth control. Okay, terrible. But it also warns employees, including, of course, professors, that even talking about abortion could result in being fired or arrested. So the faculty, it says the university must remain neutral on this topic. I don't know what that means in practice, but there we see it's like a home version of the gag rule that sometimes exists and sometimes doesn't in U.S. Foreign aid policy. So things like that are happening all over, and it's completely it's like you don't even know where to start. There's just so much of it. But I don't want to be like completely depressed because I want to say one more thing. The antis are not finished. They are not finished at all. Now that before they had their abortion ban permission, they would always say, oh, well, of course, abortion has to be legal for women who are really sick, or maybe we have to have a rape and incest exception. And we would never put women in prison for having abortions. Just the doctors, not the women, just the doctors. But now that they have Dobbs, their true program is becoming clear. So they want a nationwide 6-week ban. They're coming for Plan B, emergency contraceptive, because they have this insane belief that Plan B is an abortion. They also think what they would call chemical birth control is an abortion, hormonal birth control. So they want to ban abortion even for rape and incest. And this may be their undoing, I don't know. They want to come after in vitro fertilization, because in vitro fertilization produces more embryos than can be implanted. And so what do you do? So if you discard the other ones, isn't that murder? I mean, what about that? So they're against in vitro. Well, the Catholic Church has always been against in vitro fertilization. And indeed, any kind of conception that is not the result of penis and vagina. So that is what lies in store maybe for us. And what I want to end on a positive note, because I started by saying this is not the will of the people. This is just the will of, I don't know, maybe a third of the people, 40% of the people, 30%. Most Americans favor legal abortion. In Kansas, which is a very conservative state, there was a referendum on abortion. Should we take out of the Constitution the protection that a judge says is in there? It lost. Why did it lose? It lost because, well, first of all, a lot of women voted, but the campaign in favor of preserving abortion rights and I hate to say this, it did something that I think a lot of American feminists think is the wrong way to go. What it did was it totally emphasized respectable women having abortions for respectable reasons, whether it was rape or often a health thing, a serious health concern. They did not talk about the reproductive justice things at all. They didn't say, well, I'm really poor, I lost my job, or anything like that. It was all on the sort of thing that even if you had your qualms about abortion and the women who have them, you would definitely support these women. So it was a big success and was a real wake-up call for both sides, which was don't despair, pro-choicers, and don't get too sure of yourselves, anti-choicers. Women are registering to vote all over the country in large numbers. And that's really a good thing. So Dobbs has really woken people up. And finally, the Democratic Party is using abortion as an election issue. It's usually hasn't done that. But now it's the whole big thing because they're thinking, oh, maybe people do vote on the basis of preserving their rights. And even in the by-elections, the primaries, being pro-choice has been a good thing. For example, Sarah Palin, you probably remember her. I mean, what an impossible nut. So she was running for Congress from Alaska. She lost to a Democratic pro-choice liberal woman who is will be the first Native American to come from that state. So that was kind of amazing because Sarah Palin is very famous person with a lot of name recognition. So there are some grounds for hope. I can't say I always feel it, but one more thing, and then I'll stop, is that there is now a lot more support for abortion funds and other pro-choice organizations that help poor women access abortion. And so I think people are waking up, and I hope that they stay awake. Take that no dose, take that Ritalin or whatever, because the election is just in 40 days or so, and it could change the country. The next election really is important. So anyway, that's all. And thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you, Katha, for your insights on what is, quite a complicated terrain. And so we are at the end of our hour-and-a-half mark, but there are lots of questions and comments. So we'll take some of those, and then we can go around with the speakers having a few minutes to sum up their thoughts, because a lot of the questions are about the feminist fight back. They are about points of resistance. So I want to, I guess, turn to a question that Pragna Patel has asked, which is that, can women turn to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights? Can that play a part in the feminist fight back? Is that something Katha or Ross can answer?
Such a good question. I really don't know. I don't think that America is going to let itself be ruled by some international body. I mean, they don't even belong to the International Criminal Court. So I would be surprised if they said, oh, yeah, all these Latin Americans think we should do this. Okay. I don't think that's the way people think, but I really have no information about that.
Well, I would say one of the points that I was going to make about why it's very difficult to counter what's happening now is that we have had such blind faith in the rule of law, courts, the Constitution, when the whole thing is corrupt. The whole thing should be done. And I wish Christina were still here, because she spoke about this and how Colombian feminists are very aware of that the courts are not just the answer. You have to politicize your movement. You have to be out there and speaking. And I agree with Katha that the US would never, I mean, they don't recognize international courts, period. But even, just more generally, I think relying on the courts and thinking they would save us is a big mistake. And we see now that we can't just rely on the law and the courts. We have to be politically, strategically aware and mobilizing our movements.
I guess, thank you both for that. The next question, I think, also has to do with law, and this is by Shiri Salehin, who asks, what can be done to counteract the new abortion abolitionists who are currently attempting to change state criminal statutes so that those who receive abortions will be held liable for murder and subject to the death penalty. If either of you.
I think that's really a long shot. I think that's one of those things that's put out there to make putting the doctors in jail seem more reasonable. The anti-choicers have always said, we're not going to punish women. And I think that you can't put the world in jail. I mean, women are still going to be having abortions in very large numbers. So I think that would be a bridge too far. But although it's the logical outcome of their position, if you think that a fertilized egg is a person, then you probably you should support punishment for people who have them. But they have abortions. But they also have this other idea, which is, why do women have abortions? Women have abortions because the abortion industry forces them to do it. They don't understand what they're doing. They're confused. They're unhappy. They're in some difficult life situation. And then along comes the quote abortion industry unquote and says, here's the solution to all your problems. So the real murderers are the abortion clinics and the people who work for them. But the woman is considered to be too befuddled to make a real choice. So that's how they get out of what their logical position ought to be. And I think that they would probably realize that nobody is going to support this. They have to, I mean, they're a political movement. They have to have some kind of backing that is larger than they themselves, because there aren't that many people in America who believe, yes, abortion should always be illegal. That gets about 7 to 8% of people are that fanatical. That's not a lot of people. So I think that this is not going to go anywhere, but I've been too optimistic before, so who knows?
Thank you. I think Gita, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I wanted to respond on the criminalization point. When I was at Amnesty, we really had to think hard with quite a narrow abortion position, what we could do that wouldn't undermine the advocacy of women's groups that have been working on it much longer. And one of the things that we focused on was criminalization, because all over the world, there are women in jail for having had abortions or being suspected of having abortions, because in fact, they may have had spontaneous miscarriages. And in fact, in Britain, which does not have a large Christian right, it is there, but it has not got the strength that it has in the US. And we have a lunatic right wing. I think our audience will know whether they're in Britain or not. We have the most far right government. I mean, we've had a series of far right governments, all from the Conservative Party, each of which has become more and more madly far right. But mostly they have not been embedded in evangelism and that sort of thing. But even in Britain, where abortion has been accepted for a long time, there is a growing movement that's disrupting the clinics, American style, by disrupting people coming to them and so on. And local authorities are very slow to act to protect women. And also there is at least one woman who has been criminalized for having a late abortion and put in jail. So don't imagine it won't happen. My prediction is it will happen unless there's a massive mobilization to stop it and to protect women around this. It's going to get really bad, because already in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and other countries, all abortion was illegal. Women were put in jail. I visited women in Nigeria with my colleague Stephanie Schlitt when I was part of Amnesty, who was suspected of having had abortions and jailed for that, and so on. And while one thinks it might not happen in America, I don't see why it wouldn't.
Can I respond? Can I respond to that briefly?
Yes.
The question was specifically about murder and subject to the death penalty. That's what I think is not very likely, especially since the death penalty is less and less popular in the United States. But women have already been jailed here for all kinds of crimes, quote crimes unquote, relating to drug use in pregnancy. There are over 1,000 women who are in jail for that. Trying to commit suicide while pregnant. Baby Schwei went to jail was in prison for 2 years for that. There was a woman whose name is, her last name is Patel, but I can't remember her first name, in Indiana. And she was accused of having an abortion after, self-aborting after after the period of legality. And she went to jail. So yeah, definitely. Women are being punished now for failing to have a pregnancy that results in a healthy baby. There was a horrible case where a woman got in a fight with another woman and miscarried. She was shot and she miscarried and she was arrested in Alabama. And, but often these cases, that case was dropped when there was a lot of protest. But so I think that there is the idea that, we're not going to help you have a healthy baby, but if you don't have a healthy baby, we're coming after you. I think that it's a combination of libertarianism and punitiveness that we see in many areas of American life.
Thank you, Katha. I think Ross wants to come in. Yeah.
Well, I agree with Katha that, it's the criminalization more likely. I don't think that women are going to be, hung. But coming after doctors and criminalizing women and more of this punitive reactionism, yes. But I also would say authoritarian regimes do not rule by opinion polls. They don't care. Samuel Alito in the Dobbs decision very clearly said, really, people won't like this. They don't like it. Too bad. I mean, he said that in so many words. Too bad. This is what I'm saying is the law. So we're dealing here, yes, with theocracy and serious authoritarian threats. Not that I think this country was ever really seriously a democracy. I'm not ready to say that, but it had more democratic elements than we have today. So I want to just ask Rashmi, how much time do we have? Because I really want to get to Steve's question of where are the points of resistance, what are the possibilities of change? So I don't know.
Absolutely. I think we can get to it now, and perhaps each of you, there are 3 of you here among the speakers, could address that. And I think we've covered most of the main questions, and that does contain a lot of issues. So why don't we start concluding by looking at points of resistance and the future of the feminist movement, and where do we go from here on this question? So Ross, do you want to? Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And I actually not sure that I thanked everybody. I wanted to thank Mira Yuval Davis in Gita and the whole, feminist Dissent family for inviting me here. It's really been a pleasure, and it was very nice of you to include me in the conversation. I could not agree more with Anna Cristina. We in the US, in the North, we have to look to the South. Absolutely. The global balance of resistance to power is in Latin America. It's in places like, well, India. I just saw in the chat, the Indian court just passed a law guaranteeing legal abortion to all women in India. So I would say that Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Uruguay, Cuba's new family, I mean, their strides around legalizing abortion and decriminalizing have been amazing in the last decade. The Cubans' adoption of a new family code, which legalizes same-sex marriage and is very, very gender and sexually egalitarian. It's fantastic. Brazil is about to kick out Bolsonaro and bring back Lula. I mean, that's amazing. Thank you and congratulations to our dear Brazilian sisters and friends in the movement. And certainly in Iran, the thousands of courageous women and men, but leading them, women who are marching and risking their lives to defy the morality police and demand full rights to bodily expression and self-determination in public space. We need to see them as our models and learn from them, learn from all of them. I would see in the United States some areas of resistance that are very promising, but the challenge to certainly liberal feminists is to think broadly, look at broad coalitions, to think seriously intersectionally. High school kids in Virginia walked out of their school in protest against the governor's harsh anti-trans policies, saying trans rights are human rights. And I see that attitude reflected in my own grandchildren, my grandniece, younger people, kids, little kids who believe in, gender as a non-binary situation, who are defying gender norms, even at the age my grandniece is 8. I mean, it's fantastic. I see young activists in the environmental and gun control movements and in the frontline communities, indigenous communities, who are achieving real gains, even though there's a long, long way to go. In the labor movement, we have strikes and walkouts all over the country, but especially young workers, baristas, Amazon warehouse workers, tech workers. And then, as Katha was saying, women, because, and the Democratic Party, they get credit, are furious about the Dobbs decision. Will they take that fury and rage beyond the voting booth in the midterm elections and in 2024? Will they not only be like Kansas, the referendum in Kansas was amazing, but go beyond law, go into the streets, find the courage and the rage to be the movement that tries to make the legal, not only change the law and solidify the law, but make great changes in popular culture, because we have a culture that's, as Anita Bryant said all those many years ago, it's sick. So we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Ros. Gita or Katha, who would like to come in and to sum up and to respond to what the others have said?
Well, I think that about this issue of mobilizing people, mobilizing women, I think that I sometimes wonder where the feminist movement would be today if it hadn't had to spend so much time, brain power, money, keep on reproductive rights. That has been such a struggle for so long that I think some other areas have gotten scanted. We don't have affordable childcare. There are hundreds of thousands of women who can't get a job, who want a job because they can't afford childcare. I think that I would love to see a women's movement that was broader in its aims and made more demands on the state than what we have now in the effective, popular part of the women's movement. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not as optimistic as Roz is. I mean, yeah, okay. So thousands of high school students, or however many high school students, walked out of their classrooms for a day, but Virginia elected Youngkin. The new governor, they chose him over the Democrat. They chose a whole bunch of conservative, anti-choice, and of course anti-trans also legislators. So that to me is more important than what high school students do in one day. Maybe that shows that I'm losing my revolutionary fervor. But I think, you know, what can you do really except try to mobilize people? And I think that we'll just, I don't know, we'll have to see. I'm not too I mean, what I see is I see a lot of turmoil in the feminist movement that is not necessarily a happy story. I mean, you know, the Women's March started out so great, and now it's not. And there are all kinds of internal struggles going on, and in various reproductive rights organizations. So at the worst possible moment. So I'm not as optimistic as Roz, because, you know, a lot of people are just going to vote like, oh, I don't want my taxes to go up. They vote for anti-choice people, but they're not voting for them for that reason. They're voting for them for some economic reason, or, there is too much regulation of small business, so I'm voting for the Republicans, that kind of thing. I don't know. I don't want to end on a woolly note. We have to do our best, and gatherings like this are so important, aren't they? I learned so much from Anna's presentation. But I'm sure, Anna, that Columbia did a lot more. Columbian feminists did a lot more than go on some demonstrations. There was a whole, I mean, that 90 arguments, putting together all these people, and that's what happened in Ireland too. You know, there was a whole year of sort of collective discussion, and they had this kind of people's Congress, I forget what they called it, where they had people from all walks of life talking about abortion. And out of that came, people moved, people changed their minds. And I think that's what we have to do too. We have to change some minds. That's always, as I know from a lifetime of trying to do that without signal success, I would say, that's very hard to do. So that's why all these smart people here, it's so important to have you together, have us all together.
Thank you, Katha. I'm sure your revolutionary fervor is alive, and we need it all the more. There are a few people who've sent in personal direct messages to me that they would like to make short comments, but I think we are really running out of time, and I invite them to use our chat function to write their comments, and we will collate them and we'll be happy to share with everyone who has attended today's event. But in conclusion, I would like to invite Gita Sahgal from Feminist Dissent to sort of wrap up not only her presentation, but also the meeting as well. Gita.
Gosh, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Roz and Katha and Anna in her absence for a really rich discussion. As we said at the beginning, Feminist Dissent is a collective, it's a journal, it's an open access journal online, so that makes it very cheap, you can just look it up. And we hope to do work on these issues and to continue these discussions, but also turn them into blogs and journal issues. So we really want to encourage people to keep in touch with us and send in ideas, and we'll also be sending out calls to papers and so on. So I think what this meeting demonstrated is that there are various trends in different parts of the world. So in spite of the fact that there is a global backlash against women's rights and against broad rights to sexuality, LGBT rights, and so on, and these are connected in the right-wing attacks. I think that one of the things that we've been dealing with, and we at Feminist Dissent are something of experts at that, is the attack on secularism and universality, which has helped to pull the rug from under the feet of people who might be campaigning and gathering on these issues. So for instance, Pragna and I and Yasmin, who are part of the Feminist Dissent Collective, were part of a conference on secularism a few years ago. I think Trump had just got into power. And it was a meeting organized by ex-Muslims who are always under attack, and often with liberals lining up with the Islamic right to condemn them. Now, the meeting was focused on Islam in many ways, but there were many speakers among us who were either Muslim or were not from Muslim heritage at all, like Pragna and myself, who were speaking to the issue of secularism. And there was a US speaker from the Freedom from Religion Foundation who told us exactly what was going to happen. And as people have said, as Ros said, Trump is not really the issue. She said whether Trump gets reelected or not, he is putting in place judges not only on the federal court, but all over the country. They are going to be in place for many years, long after he's gone. And Roe versus Wade is going to be overturned, and a whole lot of other threats to human rights. And she was, of course, talking from a perspective of religion-state separation. It's in the US, secularism, I understand, means something slightly different. So, we use it as a separation of religion and state. Now, in India, in opposition to the Hindu right, we have used our constitution. We know how flawed Indian democracy has been, but it came out of an anti-colonial struggle. Indian anti-imperialists and anti-colonialists helped to construct the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with its feminist content in it, often not recognized by later feminists from the West. In fact, Latin American women were also very heavily involved with that. And we have been in India reading the Constitution. I always sit with a copy of the preamble to the Constitution because it has become a rallying cry. It's been used by lawyers, read on the grounds of courts. It's been used by students. It's been used by a huge mass Muslim women's struggle, because that is our weapon against growing Hindutva. Nobody is taking up arms. We're using not the Constitution, not just in the narrow legal sense within the court, but as a rallying cry within popular movements in the wider world, because of its aspirational focus that all citizens of India are equal, that everybody who lives here has a right to citizenship, and so on. So it's been absolutely crucial in our struggles. And yet, when we had this meeting in London a few years ago, where I talked about this, where a US speaker was highlighting this coming threat, we were all very aware of it. A meeting supposedly of reform Muslims was organized purely to oppose us, to attack the concept of secularism, and to attack our meeting. Now, we should have been people who should have been able to have a conversation, because while we may not put much faith in religious reform of any kind and within any religion, we're not opposed to people attempting it. Yet we are often being seen as the main enemy. Feminists were struggling against religious intolerance in all religions and against a kind of gloopy postmodernism and post-colonial theory that says that you don't have absolute values. You cannot campaign for these big issues, and you have to stay within your lane, within your religion, and not move out of it. So I think there are many such things that we have to look at. I noticed that in the Dobbs judgment, the equal protection clause was set aside, the equal protection argument was set aside. Now, if people as campaigners, the main organizations like Center for Reproductive Rights and population organizations and so on, are not able to refer to this as an attack on women because of their sex. Yes, some trans people are also affected, people who might identify as non-binary, but the fact is they're all female in origin, and that's why they may need to have contraception or abortion rights. And if you cannot argue for equal protection under the law on the grounds of sex, which is a category included in every single international human rights treaty and many domestic treaties, the US movement is potentially in danger of depriving itself of one way of organizing. On the other hand, I know that Latin American organizations have built very inclusive movements. So how have they done that? How have they not suppressed the existence of women as a category? And how have they built that sense of inclusion? So I think we really need to talk about these things much more and look at the ways in which we can actually support each other rather than building divisions among groups of women and among groups of feminists, whether they are religious or not, or secular or not. Thank you. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Gita, for that. And once again, I'd like to thank all our speakers and everybody who joined us. We do want to stress that we hope this is part of a continuing series of meetings and discussions. And we already have plans in place to do a special issue of our journal on this topic. So please send in your contributions and your ideas for that. And we hope that you will stay connected with us and that we will continue this conversation and to continue looking at, as Steve Cowden said, points of resistance, which can connect all of these different struggles in different parts of the world. So thank you for joining us, and I hope we will keep in touch. Thank you.